Dear students, today we are going to talk about long-term effects of migration. So, although long-term effects are complex and hard to predict, so when economic crisis happens in developed countries, it might be worse in less developed nations. The motivation is to migrate will be stronger than ever before. The underlying drivers or factors of migration will not change drastically after the recession. Then let's highlight the impact of economic crisis on migrant labor in Malaysia. As we know that Malaysia is one of the largest foreign labor pools in Asia. So during economic crisis in 1997, the government announced 200,000 migrants will be laid off in 1998, and the working permits for 700,000 migrants will not be renewed. So massive crackdown on documented migrants began in early 1998. Then the enforcement continued throughout 1998 and was due peak when the permits for a batch of 100,000 migrants were due to expire at the same time. However, the government made minor changes to the renew policy, allowing workers in certain categories in service sector to renew their permits. Then there are no official data, but however there are no official data on the total of migrants who lost their jobs and returned home voluntarily. Then the immigration department announced that 160,000 undocumented migrants in Peninsula were deported. Let's look at the impact, migration and cultural effects. Migration contributed to the richness and uniqueness of cultural, ethnicities and racial diversity. But the difficulty in observing the influence of migration on the culture relates to the question how to measure the impact migration on culture in general. Culture develops in complex ways, and the impact of migration cannot be easily measured using the number of migrants settling in various countries over time. Impact of migration on culture. Then let's say the wide range of foreign foods and ethnic restaurant. They're not only notable for the future development of cultural life, but it is also has far-reaching implications on economy. Changed eating pattern in the society, then it is not clear that his phenomenon is due to migration or globalization. World of fashion. Okay, general trend towards ethnic and racial fashion is recognized as a segment in the textile market. Then some studies also highlights that mainly in urban area they seem to adapt their clothing towards the traditional clothing. But there are some challenges are associated with migration. Number one, human trafficking, irregular migration. Then international organizational for migration policy. Human trafficking. What is human trafficking? Is defined as the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring or receipt of persons by means of the giving and receiving of payments or benefits to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person. Okay, so for the purpose of exploitation, although slavery is commonly thought to be a thing of the past, however, human traffickings or human traffickers generate hundreds of billions of dollars in profits by trapping millions of people in horrific situations around the world, including here, including Malaysia. Okay, so traffickers use violence, threats, deception, debt bondage, and the other manipulative tactics to force people to engage in commercial sex or to provide labor or services against their will. So, the International Labour Organizations estimate that there are 40.3 million victims of human trafficking globally. 81% of them are trapped in forced labor, 25% of them are children. 75% are women and girls. Then International Labour Organization also estimates that forced labor and human trafficking is a $150 billion industry worldwide. So the US Department of Labor has identified 148 goods from 75 countries made by forced and child labor in 2017. An estimated 1 out of 7 endangered runaways reported to the National Center of Missing and Exploited Children were likely child sex trafficking victims. Of those, 88% were in the care of social services or foster care when they can. Let's talk about human trafficking in Malaysia. Malaysia is one of the destinations, and to a lesser extent, a source and transit country for women and children subjected to trafficking in person, specifically conditions of forced prostitution, and for men and women and children who are in conditions of forced labor. The majority of trafficking victims are foreign workers who migrate willingly to Malaysia from Indonesia, Nepal, India, Thailand, China, the Philippines, Burma, Cambodia, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Vietnam in search of greater economic opportunities. Some of whom subsequently encounter forced labor or debt bondage at the hands of their employers, employment agent, or informal labor recruiters. Malaysia made some efforts to prevent trafficking in previous over the last year, and the government conducted numerous anti-trafficking training events for Malaysian police, immigration, prosecutors, labor department officials, and women's ministry officials, and began to partner with NGOs, international organizations, as well as foreign governments on such training. Irregular migration, information about undocumented, this refers to undocumented migrants or migrants in irregular situation is often difficult to obtain or quantify. Estimates vary greatly from one source to another. For example, the International Organization for Migration has estimated that 10 to 15% of the world's, that means 214 million international migrants in 2010 were undocumented. The United Nations Development Programme has estimated that around one third of all migration flows in countries in less developed regions were undocumented. Both the United Nations and the OECD include undocumented migrants in their estimation of migrant stocks, but the exact magnitude of migrants in irregular situation remains unknown. So irregular migration was a major concern for governments of 20 of the 25 countries with the latest migrant stocks, and for governments of 16 out of 25 nations with the highest percentage of migrants in the total population. Let's talk about post 9/11 policies. Many Americans became aggressive towards immigration because the terrorists who commit the attacks exploited gaping security holes in the US immigration system after 9/11 terrorist attack. Border security became both an immediate and long-term concern as the borders with Canada and Mexico were closed for days. Since then, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, which handled immigration prior to 9/11, has been subsumed under the Department of Homeland Security and reformulated into several new agencies, including the Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Then European Union integration. In Europe, migration and integration policies are complicated by the fact that the European Union now comprises 27 member states. The concern expressed by some Europeans is that this continuous expansion of the European Union will generate more immigration into Western Europe, bringing within it numerous problems such as inadequate integration. The entry into the European Union brings with it many advantages, but this expansion tends to trigger certain fears, especially the issue of migration and integration. Many richer member states are worried about being overrun by workers from poorer member states, while the free movement of its citizens is one of the basic liberties of the European Union. It is often associated with political anxiety. The international organizations for migration policy, many international institutions and non-governmental organizations help both developed and developing countries deal with migration, such as the previously mentioned International Organization for Migration, then building capacities for proactive policy making on environmental migration, effective early warning systems, contingency planning, well-informed populations, and ready shelter and humanitarian assistance are crucial for improved disparate preparedness and mitigating forced migration. Then capacities and contingencies need to be in place to respond to the immediate and most basic needs of displaced population in terms of shelters, food, sanitation, and medical attention. Other organizations deal with specific aspects of migration. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, provides assistance to those fleeing their native countries for fear of persecution. Then the ILO promotes fair hiring, standards, and adequate working conditions for migrants. Financial institutions such as World Bank and International Monetary Fund study the economic effects of migration. So even this briefest of overviews of the policy context and policy options to manage the development impact of migration suggests that there is much to be done. Given that the migration development nexus involves even more complex flows of people, money, and diasporic linkages. So the scale of the challenge facing policymakers is immense. One size fits all intervention and easy wins will be rare if not impossible in this era. And for any intervention to be effective, there needs to be cooperation from a range of stakeholders, not just policymakers in developed and developing countries, but also multilateral agencies, NGOs, and the private sector. Concern over undocumented immigration have been tempered by the need for migrant labor, specifically in developed nations, as well as the existence of growing refugees populations, further complicating the creation of efficient migration policy dealing with both legal and illegal immigration then is one of the pressing issues facing government and society across the world. So we end our discussion for today's lecture. Thank you very much.